It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. Love is maintained by a bond of obligation which, men being bad, is broken whenever it serves their advantage. But fear is maintained by a dread of punishment which never fails. Niccolo Machiavelli. I used to be that guy who believed kindness conquered everything. You know, the one who'd bend over backwards for colleagues, always said yes to extra work, and genuinely thought being the nice guy was my golden ticket to success. For years I lived in this bubble of innocence, believing that if I was good enough, kind enough, helpful enough, the world would reward me. What a cruel joke I was playing on myself. Reality hit me like a punch to the gut back in 2019 when I was working at a startup in Austin. I was the model employee, first to arrive, last to leave, always willing to help anyone with anything. My boss, David, used to praise me in front of everyone, called me our MVP, said the company wouldn't function without me. I felt special, loved, valued. It was exactly what I wanted to hear. But when promotion time came around, David promoted Jake, a guy who worked half as much as I did, but who had something I didn't. He wasn't afraid to say no. Jake set boundaries, questioned bad decisions, and most importantly, he was never desperately available like I was. While I was chasing approval, Jake commanded respect. The difference was crystal clear, but I was too blind to see it. That night, sitting in my tiny apartment, drinking cheap beer and stewing in my anger, I made a discovery that would change my life forever. I found an old PDF of Machiavelli's The Prince on my laptop, had downloaded it for some college class years ago. Out of curiosity, I started reading, and it was like someone had turned on a light in a dark room I'd been living in for decades. Machiavelli wasn't writing about medieval politics. He was describing exactly what had happened to me. He knew that people like David would exist 500 years later, and that people like me would be their willing victims. His question wasn't philosophical, it was strategic, practical, urgent, a matter of survival in the game everyone's playing, but few admit is happening. Over the following weeks, I began observing the dynamics around me with completely different eyes. I saw how my nice guy colleagues were constantly exploited and ignored. I saw how people who set clear boundaries, who might seem cold or difficult, were the ones who actually received respect and opportunities. I saw how my own kindness had become my greatest weakness. The painful truth was that I'd confused being loved with being respected, and that confusion was costing me my career, my relationships, and my self-esteem. People loved me because I was convenient, predictable, harmless. But love based on convenience isn't real love. It's exploitation disguised as affection, and I'd been everyone's useful idiot for years. So I started my Machiavellian experiment. Small changes first, stopped responding to emails immediately, began saying no to requests. That weren't my responsibility. Set boundaries around my personal time. The reactions were immediate and revealing. Some people got irritated. Those were the ones who saw me only as a tool. Others began treating me with more respect. Those were the ones who actually mattered. Within 6 months, my life had changed completely. I landed a promotion at another company, my personal relationships improved dramatically, and for the first time in years, I felt in control of my own life. Not because I'd become cruel or manipulative, but because I finally understood a fundamental truth our society tries to hide. Respect precedes love, not the other way around. Machiavelli had given me the key I'd been searching for without knowing it. His ancient question about fear versus love was actually a roadmap for navigating the modern world. And the more I applied his principles, the more I realized that every situation in my life, from work to relationships, from negotiations to social media, was an opportunity to consciously choose between seeking approval or commanding respect. I discovered there's a massive difference between being feared as a tyrant and being respected as someone with clear boundaries. And that distinction would be just the beginning of a journey that transformed me from a well-intentioned doormat into someone who actually understands how power works in the real world. But before you think this is about becoming a cold, calculating person, let me tell you about what I learned when I tried to apply these lessons to my personal relationships, and how I almost ruined everything by not understanding the difference between strategy and cruelty. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see and few can feel. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few really know what you are. Niccolo Machiavelli. Armed with my newfound Machiavellian insights, I thought I had it all figured out. But life has a funny way of teaching you that understanding a principle and applying it correctly are two very different things. My first real test came during what I now call the Great Relationship Disaster of 2020, a story that taught me the dangerous difference between being popular and being powerful. I was dating Sarah, this amazing marketing director I'd met through mutual friends in Denver. She was smart, successful, and had this magnetic personality that drew people in. Everyone loved Sarah. Her co-workers, her friends, even strangers at coffee shops seemed to gravitate toward her. I was honestly a little intimidated by how effortlessly popular she was, and I made a crucial mistake. I confused her popularity with real power. What I didn't see at first was the exhausting performance behind her likability. Sarah said yes to everything. Every social event, every favor, every request for help. Her phone buzzed constantly with people needing something from her. She worked late most nights because she couldn't say no to her boss's urgent projects, even when they clearly weren't her responsibility. She was everyone's favorite person, but she was miserable. The breaking point came during a work crisis at her company. Sarah had been carrying extra projects for months, covering for underperforming colleagues because she didn't want to rock the boat. When budget cuts hit, guess who got let go? Not the mediocre employees she'd been protecting, but Sarah herself. Her boss's reasoning was brutally honest. We know Sarah will land on her feet and she won't cause any drama. Her niceness had made her expendable. I watched this incredible woman, someone more talented and dedicated than half her colleagues, get discarded precisely because she was too loved. She'd become so associated with being helpful and accommodating that when tough decisions needed to be made, nobody feared the consequences of losing her. They knew she'd take it gracefully, probably even help train her replacement. That's when Machiavelli's words hit me like a freight train. Sarah wasn't powerful, despite being loved by everyone. She was powerless because of it. Love without respect is just exploitation with better marketing. Her colleagues loved her the same way people love their favorite restaurant, convenient, reliable, always there when you need it, but easily replaced when something better comes along. I started seeing this pattern everywhere. At my new job, the most popular guy in our department, Marcus, was constantly being volunteered for extra work by our manager. Marcus won't mind became the office motto. Meanwhile, Jessica from accounting, who was polite but had clear boundaries, never got voluntarily assigned anything beyond her job description. People respected her limits. The social media aspect was even more revealing. Sarah had thousands of followers who loved her positive, uplifting content, but when she posted about her job loss, asking for leads or recommendations, the response was crickets. All those friends and fans disappeared when she actually needed something. Her popularity was a mile wide and an inch deep. I realized I was witnessing the modern manifestation of Machiavelli's ancient wisdom. We live in an era where everyone's chasing likes, hearts, and thumbs ups, mistaking digital popularity for real influence. Instagram followers, LinkedIn connections, Facebook friends. We've gamified love and called it success, but none of these metrics translate to actual power when you need it most. The harsh lesson was that being everyone's favorite person often means being nobody's priority. When Sarah was riding high, everyone wanted to be associated with her positivity and energy. The moment she showed vulnerability, those same people vanished. They loved the version of her that served their needs, not the complete human being who occasionally needed support herself. This wasn't just about romantic relationships or individual careers. I started noticing it in politics, business, entertainment, everywhere. The leaders who try to be loved by everyone end up being controlled by everyone. They become prisoners of their own popularity, unable to make hard decisions because they might disappoint someone. But here's what really opened my eyes. Watching Sarah's transformation after she lost that job. She stopped trying to be everyone's favorite person and started being selective about who deserved her time and energy. She became more strategic about her career moves, more direct in her communication, more protective of her boundaries. Within a year, she'd landed a better position with a 20% salary increase at a company that actually valued her skills, not just her agreeability. The woman who emerged from that experience was still kind, still generous, but now she understood the difference between being loved and being respected. She'd learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and others is to set clear boundaries and stick to them, even when it makes people uncomfortable. That experience taught me that Machiavelli's question wasn't just about leadership or politics. It was about every relationship, every interaction, every moment where you choose between seeking approval and commanding respect. And I was about to learn just how dangerous it could be to swing too far in the opposite direction. Since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. Niccolò Machiavelli. After watching Sarah's transformation, I became obsessed with understanding what real strategic fear looked like. I mean, Machiavelli wasn't advocating for becoming a psychopath, right? There had to be a difference between being respected and being a tyrant. My education in this distinction came from an unexpected source. My new manager at a tech company in Seattle, a woman named Elena Rodriguez. Elena was fascinating to observe. She wasn't mean, she wasn't a screamer, she didn't throw tantrums or make threats. But everyone, and I mean everyone, respected her boundaries completely. When Elena said a deadline was non-negotiable, nobody even attempted to negotiate. When she assigned tasks, they got done exactly as specified. When she called a meeting, people showed up prepared and on time. It was like watching a master class in controlled authority. What struck me most was how she achieved this respect without anyone actually disliking her. During my first week, I watched her handle a situation that would have destroyed most managers. Our biggest client was demanding impossible changes to a project that was already over budget and behind schedule. The client's CEO was screaming over the phone, threatening to pull their contract, basically throwing a corporate tantrum. Elena listened calmly, then said something I'll never forget. "I understand you're frustrated, but here's what's going to happen. We'll implement the changes we discussed in our original scope. Anything beyond that will require a new timeline and budget. If that doesn't work for you, we'll part ways professionally and deliver what we've completed so far." The silence on the other end was deafening. 10 minutes later, the client agreed to her terms. I realized I was witnessing strategic fear in action. The client wasn't afraid Elena would yell or retaliate. They were afraid she would do exactly what she said she'd do. She had established a reputation for being completely reliable in her consequences. When Elena set a boundary, you could bet your life she'd enforce it. That certainty was more powerful than any threat or emotional manipulation. This was my first glimpse of what Machiavelli really meant. Strategic fear isn't about intimidation or cruelty. It's about the absolute certainty of consistent consequences. Elena had trained everyone around her to understand that crossing her clearly defined lines would result in predictable, professional, but firm responses. Nobody tested her because everyone knew exactly what would happen if they did. I started studying Elena's methods like a detective. She never raised her voice, but her disappointed tone was more effective than any screaming match. She never threatened people's jobs, but her detailed documentation of performance issues made it clear that poor work had consequences. She never played favorites, but her consistent standards meant everyone knew exactly where they stood at all times. The psychology behind it was brilliant. Fear of the unknown is paralyzing, but fear of the known is manageable and actionable. Elena removed all uncertainty from the equation. Cross this line, and this specific thing will happen. Meet these standards and you'll be recognized and rewarded. The rules were crystal clear, and so were the consequences for breaking them. What really impressed me was how this approach actually made people feel safer, not more anxious. There's something deeply reassuring about working for someone whose reactions are completely predictable. With Elena, you never had to worry about hidden agendas, surprise punishments, or inconsistent standards. You knew exactly what was expected and exactly what would happen if you didn't deliver. I watched other managers in our company struggle with team performance issues that Elena never had. They'd make vague threats they couldn't or wouldn't follow through on, create unclear expectations, or try to be everyone's friend while still maintaining authority. Their teams were constantly anxious because nobody knew where the real boundaries were or what the actual consequences might be. Elena taught me that strategic fear isn't about making people scared, it's about making them certain that excellence will be recognized, certain that mediocrity won't be tolerated, certain that the rules apply to everyone equally, and certain that promises and threats will be kept with equal reliability. This certainty created an environment where people could focus on performing instead of politicking. The most revealing moment came during our quarterly review. Eleanor pulled me aside and said something that completely shifted my understanding. I don't want my team to be afraid of me as a person. I want them to be afraid of disappointing themselves in front of someone who holds high standards. There's a big difference. That distinction was everything. I realized that what I'd been calling fear was actually respect for consistent leadership. Elena had created a culture where people pushed themselves to excel, not because they were terrified of punishment, but because they didn't want to fall short of standards they'd come to respect and internalize. She'd made excellence feel inevitable rather than optional. But watching Elena also revealed something crucial that I almost missed in my enthusiasm for this new approach. Her strategic authority worked because it was paired with genuine investment in her team's success. She was feared and respected, but also trusted. And that combination, authority plus genuine care, was something I was about to learn the hard way, was much more difficult to achieve than I thought. Soon I'd discover that understanding the theory of strategic fear and actually implementing it without destroying relationships were two completely different challenges. A prince ought to inspire fear in such a way that, if he does not win love, he avoids hatred, because he can endure very well being feared whilst he is not hated. Niccolo Machiavelli. Watching Eleanor's masterful use of strategic authority made me cocky. I thought I'd cracked the code, that all I needed to do was stop being a pushover and start setting boundaries. But Machiavelli's wisdom came with a warning I was too arrogant to heed. Swing too far toward fear, and you become a tyrant. What I needed to understand first were the catastrophic consequences of staying trapped in love dependency. Lessons I learned through watching 3 people destroy their lives trying to be loved by everyone. The first case study walked into my life in the form of my new roommate, Brian, a genuinely good guy who'd just moved to Seattle for a marketing job at a promising startup. Brian was the kind of person who'd give you the shirt off his back, loan you money he couldn't afford to lose, and always put everyone else's needs before his own. Within 3 months of living with him, I watched him get systematically destroyed by his own kindness. Brian's company was bleeding money, missing deadlines and losing clients, but he couldn't see the writing on the wall because he was too busy being everyone's favorite employee. When his boss started asking him to work weekends just this once, Brian said yes. When that became every weekend, Brian said yes again. When his co-workers started dumping their responsibilities on him because Brian's so good at this stuff, he took it as a compliment and said yes some more. The breaking point came when the company laid off half the staff. Brian was convinced he was safe because everyone loved him, because he was indispensable, because he'd sacrificed everything for the team. Instead, he was the first to go. His boss's explanation was brutal in its honesty. "We know you'll understand, Brian. You're not going to cause problems or badmouth us. We need to keep the people who might." His niceness had made him the safest person to fire. But Brian's story gets worse. Because he'd been working so much overtime for free, he hadn't been building relationships outside work. Because he'd been so focused on being loved by his colleagues, he hadn't been networking or developing marketable skills. Because he'd been saying yes to everything, he'd never learned to advocate for himself. When he needed help finding a new job, all those people who loved him suddenly became very busy. The second case study was even more painful to watch because it involved my own family. My cousin Jennifer had always been the golden child, the one who never caused trouble, who made everyone happy, who smoothed over every family conflict with her endless patience and understanding. She married her college boyfriend not because she was passionate about him, but because everyone expected it. because it made her parents happy, because breaking up would have disappointed people. For 15 years, Jennifer lived a life designed to maintain everyone else's comfort. She stayed in a marriage that slowly drained her soul because divorce would upset her traditional parents. She took a safe teaching job instead of pursuing her photography dreams because it was what responsible people did. She had kids when her husband wanted them, not when she felt ready. Every major decision in her life was filtered through one question: what will make other people happy? The crash came when she turned 40. Depression hit her like a freight train, and suddenly all that love she'd been so carefully cultivating evaporated. Her husband left her for someone more fun. Her parents criticized her for not trying hard enough to save the marriage. Her friends, tired of her constant emotional needs after years of her being their unpaid therapist, started avoiding her calls. She'd spent 4 decades earning love through service, and when she finally needed that love returned, nobody was there. The third case study was professional and hit closest to home. I'd been following the career of this CEO, Michael Patterson, who ran a mid-sized tech company in Portland. Patterson was famous for his family culture approach: no layoffs, generous benefits, democratic decision-making, everyone's voice matters. Business magazines loved him. Employees rated the company highly on Glassdoor, and he was constantly invited to speak at conferences about humane leadership. But behind the scenes, Patterson's company was hemorrhaging money. His refusal to make hard decisions meant keeping underperforming employees who dragged down the entire team. His democratic approach meant projects took forever to get approved and implemented. His generous policies attracted people who wanted easy jobs, not high performers who wanted to build something great. When the market shifted and competitors started eating their lunch, Patterson was too invested in being loved to make the brutal changes necessary for survival. The company's death spiral was agonizing to watch from the outside. Investors started pulling funding. Key clients jumped ship. Top performers left, for companies with clearer direction and higher standards. But Patterson kept holding all-hands meetings, talking about staying true to our values and weather this storm together. He was like the captain of the Titanic, organizing a group hug while the ship went down. When the company finally collapsed, the aftermath was revealing. Those employees he'd protected and pampered, they blamed him for the failure, sued the company for unpaid benefits, and trash-talked him on social media. The key family culture he'd built evaporated the moment real hardship hit. His kindness hadn't earned him loyalty. It had attracted people who wanted comfort without accountability. Watching these 3 implosions taught me something terrifying about love dependency. It's not just ineffective, it's actively destructive. When you build your life around being loved, you attract people who are comfortable taking without giving. You enable their worst behaviors while suppressing your own needs and standards. You become addicted to approval, and like any addiction, you need bigger and bigger hits to feel satisfied. The psychology behind love dependency is insidious. It feels noble and selfless, but it's actually deeply selfish. You're manipulating others' emotions to get the approval fix you crave. You're not really serving others, you're serving your own need to be needed. And the people who benefit from your boundaryless generosity aren't actually grateful. They're contemptuous. Because deep down they know you're doing it for yourself, not for them. Most dangerously, love dependency makes you predictable and therefore controllable. When people know you'll always choose their comfort over your own standards, they'll exploit that knowledge ruthlessly. You become a resource to be consumed, not a person to be respected. And when you're no longer useful, you'll discover that love based on utility isn't love at all. The hardest lesson from these 3 disasters was realizing how close I'd come to following the same path. My own love addiction could have easily led me down any of these roads, but seeing the wreckage helped me understand why Machiavelli's alternative wasn't just more effective, it was essential for survival. The question was no longer whether to choose fear over love, but how to implement strategic authority without becoming the kind of person I'd never want to become. The best fortress is to be found in the love of the people, for although you may have fortresses, they will not save you if you are hated by the people. Niccolo Machiavelli. After witnessing those 3 catastrophic examples of love dependency, I was determined to apply Machiavelli's principles in my own career. But I quickly learned that understanding the theory and executing it in real-world professional situations are completely different beasts. My testing ground became a critical project at my Seattle tech company, and the results taught me exactly when to deploy strategic fear and when it could backfire spectacularly. The opportunity came in spring of 2021, when our company landed a massive client that could potentially double our revenue. The catch? The project had an impossible timeline, a team of mixed skill levels, and a client notorious for changing requirements midstream. Our VP, Karen, asked me to lead the project team, and I saw it as my chance to implement Elena's approach to strategic authority. I was about to learn that context is everything. My first mistake was assuming that authority automatically transfers across different situations. Elena had years of established credibility and a formal management position. I was a project leader with no direct reports, trying to influence peers who had no obligation to follow my direction. When I tried to set firm boundaries about scope changes and deadline negotiations, the team's reaction wasn't respect, it was rebellion. The pivotal moment came during our third week, when Jennifer from design, not my cousin, different Jennifer, pushed back against my requirements for detailed mock-ups. In my Elena-inspired confidence, I said something I immediately regretted. This isn't a discussion, Jennifer. These standards are non-negotiable, and if you can't meet them, I'll need to find someone who can. The conference room went dead silent. I'd just threatened a peer in front of the entire team. What happened next was a masterclass in why strategic fear requires earned authority. Jennifer, who had 5 years more experience than me and relationships throughout the company, simply said, "Interesting approach, David. Good luck with that." She then proceeded to do exactly the minimum required, while quietly undermining my authority with other team members. Within days, I could feel the team's energy shifting from collaborative to hostile. I was learning the hard way that Machiavelli's principles aren't just about choosing fear over love. They're about having the power to make that choice meaningful. Without established authority, my attempts at boundary setting just made me look like an insecure wannabe dictator. The team didn't fear disappointing me because they didn't respect my position enough for my disappointment to matter. The project started falling apart. Deadlines were missed, communication broke down, and the client began expressing concerns about our team's coordination. I realized I'd swung too far in the wrong direction at the wrong time. Unlike Elena, who had built her authority over years of consistent performance, I was trying to manufacture respect through force, and it was backfiring catastrophically. That's when I had a moment of clarity that probably saved my career. During a particularly tense team meeting, I did something unexpected. I admitted my mistake, not in a self-deprecating, approval-seeking way, but with honest accountability. "I screwed up," I told the team. "I've been trying to lead through authority I haven't earned yet. Let me show you a different approach." Instead of demanding compliance, I started demonstrating competence. When the client requested major changes that would blow our timeline, I didn't dictate the response. I presented 3 detailed options with clear trade-offs and let the team help choose the best path. When Jennifer's designs came back incomplete, instead of threatening consequences, I sat with her to understand the bottlenecks and offered specific support to remove obstacles. The transformation was remarkable. By shifting from demanding fear to earning respect, I started getting genuine cooperation. The team began holding themselves to higher standards because they could see I was holding myself to those same standards. When I did need to be firm about critical deadlines or quality requirements, the team responded positively because they trusted that my decisions were based on project success, not ego. The real test came when our client tried to add a massive feature change 2 weeks before launch. The old me would have either caved immediately to avoid conflict or made unilateral demands that would have alienated my team. Instead, I called a team meeting and laid out the situation honestly. Here's what they're asking, here's what it would cost us, and here's what I think we should do. But this affects all of us, so I want your input before I respond. What happened next taught me the most valuable lesson about professional authority. The team unanimously supported my recommendation, to push back against the client's unreasonable demands. Jennifer, who I'd initially alienated, volunteered to create visual documentation showing why the change would compromise the entire project. When I presented our united front to the client, they respected our position and accepted a scaled-down version of their request. We delivered the project on time, under budget, and with the client so satisfied they immediately signed a follow-up contract worth 40% more than the original. But more importantly, I'd learned that real authority in professional settings comes from competence plus consistency, not from demands plus threats. The team didn't fear disappointing me because I might punish them. They respected not disappointing me because they'd seen my commitment to their success. The experience taught me that Machiavelli's question about fear versus love isn't binary. It's contextual. In Eleanor's position as an established manager, strategic authority worked because she had the institutional power to back it up. In my position as a peer leader, I needed to earn respect through demonstration, before I could maintain it through boundaries. But the most valuable insight was understanding that professional fear, when done right, isn't about making people afraid of you personally. It's about making them afraid of falling short of standards they've come to respect. The difference between tyranny and leadership isn't the presence or absence of boundaries, but whether those boundaries serve the mission or just your ego. This lesson would become crucial when I started applying these same principles to my personal relationships, where the stakes were even higher and the margin for error much smaller. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. Niccolo Machiavelli. Fresh off my professional success with the project team, I felt ready to tackle the more complex arena of personal relationships. What I didn't anticipate was how much harder it would be to apply Machiavellian principles with people you actually love. My crash course came through my relationship with Sarah, which had evolved significantly since her job loss transformation, and a friendship that nearly imploded because I misunderstood the difference between strategic boundaries and emotional manipulation. Sarah and I had been together for almost 2 years by this point, and our dynamic had shifted dramatically since her career awakening. She was no longer the people-pleasing woman I'd first dated, and honestly, it was both attractive and challenging. The new Sarah had clear boundaries, called out behavior she didn't like, and wasn't afraid to disagree with me. For the first time in my life, I was dating someone who couldn't be taken for granted. The real test came when we started discussing moving in together. The old Sarah would have automatically accommodated my preferences, my neighborhood, my timeline, my furniture. The new Sarah presented her requirements with the same clarity Elena used in business meetings. She wanted a specific type of neighborhood, a particular timeline for the move, and equal say in all major decisions. When I tried to negotiate around her boundaries, she didn't get emotional or argumentative. She simply restated her position and made it clear these weren't suggestions. Initially, this frustrated me. Part of me missed having a girlfriend who was eager to please, who made everything easy and comfortable. But I quickly realized I was experiencing something I'd never had before, genuine respect from a romantic partner. Sarah wasn't agreeing with me to avoid conflict or win approval. When she did agree, it was because she actually agreed. When she supported my decisions, it meant something because I knew she'd tell me if she didn't. The turning point came during a dinner party at our friends Mark and Lisa's house. Mark was one of those guys who constantly made subtle digs at his wife in front of other people, jokes about her cooking, her driving, her career choices. Lisa would laugh along nervously, clearly uncomfortable, but trying to keep the peace. I watched Sarah observe this dynamic with growing disgust. Later that evening, Mark made a particularly cruel comment about Lisa's weight gain, disguised as a harmless joke. The old Sarah might have laughed politely or changed the subject. The new Sarah looked Mark dead in the eye and said, "That wasn't funny, Mark, it was just mean." The entire room went silent. Mark tried to deflect with more humor, but Sarah wasn't backing down. "I'm serious. Lisa deserves better than that from her husband." What happened next was fascinating. Instead of creating drama, Sarah's direct confrontation actually improved the entire evening. Mark, clearly embarrassed, apologized to Lisa and spent the rest of the night being genuinely attentive to her. Lisa, emboldened by Sarah's example, started expressing her own opinions more freely. The whole group dynamic shifted from uncomfortable politeness to genuine interaction. Watching this taught me something crucial about power dynamics in personal relationships. Sarah hadn't been cruel or aggressive. She'd simply refused to enable bad behavior. By setting a clear boundary around what she would and wouldn't tolerate, she'd actually made the entire situation healthier for everyone involved. Her willingness to risk social discomfort had created space for more authentic connection. But I was about to learn that there's a fine line between healthy boundaries and manipulative control. My education came through my friendship with Tom, a college buddy who'd moved to Seattle around the same time I did. Tom was going through a messy divorce and had been leaning on me heavily for emotional support. For months I'd been the friend who always answered his 3 a.m. phone calls, who listened to him repeat the same complaints endlessly, who dropped everything when he needed company. Inspired by my newfound understanding of boundaries, I decided to apply some strategic limits to our friendship. But here's where I made a crucial mistake. I confused setting healthy boundaries with using emotional leverage for control. Instead of having an honest conversation about what I could and couldn't provide as a friend, I started using my support as a bargaining chip. When Tom called during a date with Sarah, I didn't answer, and then told him later that his timing was inconsiderate of my relationship. When he wanted to rehash the same divorce complaints for the 100th time, I'd say things like, "I've already given you my advice on this, Tom. If you're not going to take it, why do you keep asking?" I thought I was being strategic and boundary setting. In reality, I was being manipulative and punitive. The breaking point came when Tom was having a genuinely bad day. His ex-wife had shown up at his workplace to cause a scene, and he desperately needed someone to talk to. But I was annoyed because he'd ignored my previous advice about avoiding contact with her. Instead of offering support, I gave him a lecture about natural consequences and how he needed to respect my time and emotional energy. Tom's response cut through all my pseudo-Machiavellian bullshit. "David, what happened to you? You used to be a friend. Now you're like some kind of emotional accountant, keeping track of everything I owe you." He was absolutely right. I'd taken Machiavelli's principles and twisted them into a system for controlling and punishing people instead of protecting my own boundaries and well-being. The difference became crystal clear when I compared my approach with Tom to Sarah's approach with Mark. Sarah had set a boundary to protect Lisa and improve the situation for everyone. I had set conditions to control Tom's behavior and make myself feel powerful. Sarah's boundary was about values and standards. My conditions were about leverage and manipulation. That night, I had a long conversation with Sarah about what I'd been doing wrong. She helped me understand that strategic boundaries in personal relationships aren't about gaining power over other people. They're about maintaining your own integrity and self-respect. The goal isn't to control how others behave, but to be clear about what behavior you will and won't accept in your presence. I called Tom the next day and apologized. Not the manipulative kind of apology designed to get back in his good graces, but a genuine acknowledgement that I'd been using our friendship as a testing ground for power plays instead of being an actual friend. We had an honest conversation about what kinds of support I could realistically provide and what kinds of conversations were draining for me. The result was a much healthier friendship. Tom stopped using me as his primary emotional dumping ground and started seeing a therapist. I stopped feeling resentful about our interactions because I'd been honest about my limits. Most importantly, I learned that the best application of Machiavellian principles in personal relationships isn't about gaining power over people you care about. It's about maintaining enough self-respect to be genuinely caring without becoming a doormat. But mastering personal relationship dynamics was just the beginning. The real test of these principles was about to come in high-stakes negotiations, where money, career advancement, and major life decisions hung in the balance. He who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner effects his ruin than his preservation. Niccolo Machiavelli. Armed with hard-won lessons about personal boundaries, I thought I was ready to tackle high-stakes negotiations. My opportunity came in late 2021, when my company offered me a promotion to senior project manager, but with a salary that was insulting given my track record and market value. This negotiation would become my masterclass in applying Machiavellian principles when real money and career advancement were on the line. The initial offer was $78,000, about $15,000 below market rate and barely a 10% increase from my current salary. My old self would have accepted gratefully, thrilled to be chosen and afraid to seem ungrateful. But I'd learned enough about strategic positioning to know this was a test. They were seeing if I knew my tone value or if I'd settle for whatever scraps they offered. I spent 2 weeks researching comparable positions, documenting my contributions to major projects, and most importantly, quietly exploring other opportunities. This wasn't about bluffing. It was about understanding my true position in the negotiation. Machiavelli understood that real power comes from having genuine alternatives, not from pretending you have options you don't actually possess. When I scheduled the follow-up meeting, with Karen, my VP, I made sure to approach it with the same strategic thinking Elena had demonstrated. I didn't go in angry or demanding. Instead, I presented my case like a business proposal. Here's the market data, here's my track record, here's what comparable positions pay, and here's what I need to make this role work for both of us. Karen's first response was predictable corporate deflection. We'd love to pay everyone more, David, but budgets are tight this year. Maybe we can revisit this in 6 months. The old me would have accepted this vague promise and hoped for the best. Instead, I did something that felt terrifying but proved crucial. I gently but firmly rejected her non-answer. I appreciate the budget constraints, Karen, but I need to make a decision based on current reality, not future possibilities. I then presented my research showing that my current project had generated over $2 million in revenue for the company. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for compensation that reflects my contribution to the bottom line. The silence that followed felt eternal. Karen stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. I could practically see her recalculating my position in the company hierarchy. I wasn't the grateful young employee who'd take whatever was offered. I was a professional who understood my market value and wasn't afraid to advocate for it. But here's where I almost blew the entire negotiation. Feeling emboldened by her obvious surprise, I was tempted to push harder, to make demands, to flex this newfound power. That's when Machiavelli's wisdom about knowing when to stop became crucial. The goal wasn't to humiliate Karen or prove I could be difficult. It was to reach an agreement that worked for both parties. Look, I continued, I love working here, and I want this promotion to be successful for everyone. But I need to know that my contributions are valued appropriately. What would it take to get us closer to market rate? By framing it as a collaborative problem-solving session rather than a confrontation, I gave Karen a way to say yes without losing face. The negotiation took 3 more meetings over 2 weeks. Karen came back with $85,000, which was progress but still below market. Instead of accepting or rejecting immediately, I used a technique I'd learned from watching Sarah's transformation. I acknowledged the movement while maintaining my position. I appreciate you working on this, Karen. That's definitely better, but it's still about $8,000 below market rate for this role. During this process, something interesting happened. Karen started asking for my input on other department issues, my opinion on hiring decisions, my thoughts on process improvements, my recommendations for handling difficult clients. I realized that by advocating for myself professionally, I'd earned a different kind of respect. I wasn't just another employee anymore. I was someone whose judgment Karen valued. The breakthrough came when I received a job offer from another company, $95,000 for a similar role. This wasn't a negotiation tactic. It was a genuine opportunity I'd been exploring, but it gave me something invaluable, a real alternative that removed desperation from the equation. When I shared this development with Karen, I was careful to present it as information, not as a threat. I wanted to be transparent with you, Karen. I've received an offer that's significantly higher than what we've been discussing. I'd prefer to stay here because I believe in what we're building, but I need to make the decision that's best for my career and financial future. Karen's response surprised me. Instead of getting defensive or trying to guilt me into staying, she asked detailed questions about the other offer and what it would take to keep me. For the first time in the negotiation, I felt like we were truly collaborating rather than positioning against each other. Within a week, she came back with 92,000 plus additional vacation time and a clear path to senior management. I accepted the offer, but the real victory wasn't the extra money. It was the transformation in how Karen and the entire company viewed me. I demonstrated that I understood my value and wasn't afraid to pursue it. This reputation preceded me into every subsequent interaction. Projects came with higher budgets, my recommendations carried more weight, and other departments started requesting my involvement in strategic initiatives. The psychology behind this transformation fascinated me. By showing I was willing to walk away, I'd proven I wasn't desperate for their approval or dependent on their benevolence. This made me more valuable, not less. Karen later told me that the negotiation had convinced her I was ready for increased responsibilities because I'd shown I could advocate for myself and make hard decisions under pressure. But the most important lesson was understanding that strategic negotiation isn't about getting everything you want through force or manipulation. It's about creating situations where all parties feel like they're getting value while ensuring you're not sacrificing your own interests for the sake of being agreeable. Machiavelli knew that sustainable power comes from mutually beneficial arrangements, not from zero-sum victories that create resentment. This principle would prove even more crucial when I started applying these lessons to the digital world, where reputation and perception could be built or destroyed with a single tweet, and where the old rules of power were being rewritten in real time. A wise prince ought to observe some such rules, and never in peaceful times stand idle, but increase his resources with industry in such a way that they may be available to him in adversity. Niccolò Machiavelli. My success with salary negotiation gave me confidence, but I was about to discover that the digital world operates by completely different rules. My education in online power dynamics came through a LinkedIn post that went viral for all the wrong reasons, teaching me that in the age of social media, Machiavelli's principles needed serious adaptation to survive the speed and permanence of digital judgment. It started innocently enough. After my promotion, I was feeling good about my career trajectory and decided to share some insights about negotiation on LinkedIn. I wrote a post about the importance of knowing your market value and advocating for yourself professionally. It was thoughtful, well-researched, and included specific examples of how to prepare for salary discussions. Within hours, it had dozens of likes and encouraging comments from my network. But then someone shared it in a Facebook group for young professionals, and the tone of the responses shifted dramatically. Suddenly, I was being accused of privilege, of giving advice that only worked for certain types of people, of being tone-deaf to the struggles of others in the job market. Comments started pouring in from people who'd never met me, making assumptions about my background, my opportunities, and my character based on a single post. My first instinct was pure people-pleasing panic. I wanted to apologize, to clarify, to explain that I understood not everyone had the same opportunities. I started drafting a long response, addressing every criticism, acknowledging every valid point, trying to win back the approval of complete strangers who decided I was the enemy. This was my old pattern playing out in digital form, the desperate need to be loved by everyone, even people whose opinions shouldn't matter to me. But then I remembered Sarah's response to Mark at that dinner party. She hadn't apologized for setting a boundary or tried to make everyone comfortable with her position. She'd stated her values clearly and let others react however they chose. I deleted my apologetic draft and stepped away from my computer for 24 hours to think strategically about my response. When I came back, the comment thread had exploded. Hundreds of responses, some supportive, many hostile, all debating the merits of my advice and my character. This was my introduction to how quickly digital dynamics can spiral beyond your control. In the physical world, conflicts happen in real time with specific people in specific contexts. Online, your words can be stripped of context, shared with audiences you never intended to reach, and judged by people operating from completely different frameworks. I had two choices: engage in damage control by trying to appease every critic, or stand by my original position while addressing legitimate concerns professionally. The first option would have meant endless apologies and clarifications, probably satisfying no one and definitely destroying my credibility. The second option meant accepting that some people would dislike me based on incomplete information, but maintaining respect among people whose opinions actually mattered to my career and goals. I chose the Machiavellian path. Instead of responding to every negative comment, I posted a single follow-up that acknowledged the complexity of workplace negotiations while reaffirming the core value of my original message. I thanked people for thoughtful critiques and ignored those who were clearly just looking for targets to attack. Most importantly, I didn't apologize for sharing advice that had genuinely helped me and others in my network. The results were fascinating. The people who'd been looking for a fight quickly moved on to other targets when I didn't give them the dramatic response they wanted. Several professionals in my industry reached out privately to share their own negotiation successes and thank me for speaking openly about a topic many people find uncomfortable. 3 recruiters contacted me about opportunities, specifically mentioning that they'd been impressed by how I'd handled the criticism. But the most valuable lesson came from watching how different people in my network responded to the controversy. Some colleagues distanced themselves, afraid to be associated with someone who'd attracted negative attention. Others doubled down on their support, sharing their own stories and amplifying my message. This digital crisis had revealed who in my network was genuinely supportive versus who was just along for the ride when things were easy. This experience taught me that Machiavelli's principles are especially crucial in digital spaces because the stakes are both higher and more permanent. A poorly handled online controversy can follow you for years, appearing in Google searches and affecting professional opportunities. But handled strategically, even negative attention can demonstrate your character and values to the people who matter. I started observing other professionals who navigated digital criticism effectively. They shared common traits. They responded to genuine criticism with thoughtfulness, but ignored obvious trolling. They maintained consistent values across platforms rather than adapting their message to please different audiences, and they built genuine relationships rather than chasing likes and follower counts. The most successful digital strategists understood something crucial. Online influence isn't about being loved by everyone. It's about being respected by the right people. They cultivated networks of professionals who valued their expertise rather than trying to appeal to the broadest possible audience. When criticism came, they had established credibility that protected them from temporary outrage cycles. This shift in approach transformed my online presence. Instead of posting content designed to generate maximum likes, I focused on sharing insights that would be valuable to my professional community, even if they might be controversial to others. I stopped responding to every comment and started engaging meaningfully with people whose perspectives added value to the conversation. The results spoke for themselves. My network became smaller but more engaged. Opportunities started coming through digital connections, speaking engagements, consulting projects, job offers. When I did face criticism, it was easier to evaluate whether it was worth addressing because I had a clear sense of who my target audience was and what my goals were for my online presence. But perhaps most importantly, I learned that digital courage, the willingness to express authentic views despite potential backlash, was becoming increasingly rare and therefore increasingly valuable. In a world where most people were self-censoring to avoid any possible offense, those willing to take principled stands were standing out more than ever. This digital literacy would prove essential when I started applying these lessons to formal leadership roles, where the ability to make unpopular decisions while maintaining team cohesion would determine not just my success, but the success of everyone counting on my guidance. A prince who is not himself wise cannot be wisely advised, unless by chance he has yielded his affairs entirely to one person who happens to be a very prudent man. Niccolo Machiavelli. My digital baptism by fire prepared me for what came next. Actual leadership responsibility. In early 2022, our company acquired a smaller tech firm, and I was promoted to Director of Integration. responsible for merging two teams with completely different cultures, processes, and expectations. This role would teach me the hardest lesson about Machiavellian leadership, that sometimes being a good leader means being temporarily hated by the people you're trying to help. The acquired company, a Portland-based startup called Innovate Tech, had a radically different culture from ours. They prided themselves on consensus-based decision-making, flexible deadlines, and what they called work-life harmony. Every major decision went through multiple team meetings, feedback sessions, and collaborative refinement processes. It sounded progressive and employee-friendly, but the reality was organizational paralysis disguised as democracy. My first week observing their operations was eye-opening. I watched a simple decision about which project management software to use turn into a month-long committee process involving 15 people, countless meetings, and a final choice that satisfied no one because it was a compromise between incompatible requirements. Meanwhile, their biggest client was threatening to leave because deliverables were consistently 3 weeks behind schedule. The Innovate Tech team genuinely believed their collaborative approach was superior to our more hierarchical structure. During our first combined team meeting, their former CEO, Marcus, now serving as a senior developer, actually criticized our company's authoritarian decision-making process. "We believe in trusting our people to make decisions together," he said with obvious pride. "Everyone's voice matters here." I had two choices: try to blend our cultures gradually through compromise and consensus, or implement the structural changes necessary for the integration to succeed, knowing it would initially create resentment and resistance. The first option would have made me popular in the short term, but would have doomed the integration project. The second option meant becoming the bad guy, while the teams adjusted to new realities. Machiavelli's advice was clear: decisive leadership during transitions is essential, even when it's unpopular. I chose to be the temporary villain rather than the permanent failure. Within 2 weeks, I had established new reporting structures, standardized our project management processes, and set non-negotiable deadlines for the integration milestones. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Marcus led the resistance, calling emergency culture preservation meetings and encouraging his former team to document their concerns about our corporate takeover of their values. Several Innovate Tech employees requested transfers to other departments. 2 quit outright, claiming they couldn't work in an oppressive environment. For about 6 weeks, I was genuinely despised by half my team. But here's what Machiavelli understood about leadership during crises: short-term unpopularity is the price of long-term effectiveness. While Marcus was organizing resistance meetings, I was working 18-hour days, ensuring that our first major client deliverable would be completed on time and exceed expectations. While his supporters were writing complaints to HR, I was identifying the high performers on both teams and giving them increased responsibility and recognition. The turning point came when we delivered our first integrated project 2 days ahead of schedule and 15% under budget. The client was so impressed, they immediately expanded their contract by 40%. Suddenly, the Innovate Tech team members who'd been most critical started asking questions about our processes instead of just complaining about them. Marcus, who'd positioned himself as the defender of the old way, found himself increasingly isolated as his former teammates began embracing the new structure. It turned out that many of them had been privately frustrated with the endless meetings and delayed decisions, but hadn't felt safe expressing these concerns in their collaborative environment. My authoritarian approach had actually given them permission to focus on work instead of politics. The most revealing moment came during a quarterly review, when Sarah Chen, one of the most vocal critics of our integration approach, asked to speak with me privately. "I owe you an apology, David," she said. "I thought you were just trying to destroy what we'd built. But I've gotten more meaningful work done in the past 3 months than I did in the previous year. I didn't realize how much energy I was spending on meetings that didn't actually accomplish anything." This experience taught me something crucial about leadership. True empathy sometimes requires making decisions that people won't initially appreciate. The Innovate Tech team thought they wanted endless consultation and consensus building, but what they actually needed was clear direction and accountability. By giving them what they needed instead of what they thought they wanted, I'd ultimately served them better than Marcus had with his democratic rhetoric. The integration project became a case study within our company for successful organizational change management. Both teams exceeded their performance metrics. Employee satisfaction scores actually improved once people adjusted to the new structure, and we retained 85% of the acquired talent, well above industry averages for similar integrations. But the personal cost was significant. I'd spent 3 months being genuinely disliked by people I was trying to help. There were nights when I questioned whether I was becoming the kind of leader I'd always criticized: authoritarian, insensitive to employee concerns, focused only on results. The difference was that my decisions were based on what would actually benefit the team and company long-term, not on what would make me feel powerful or important. Marcus eventually left for another startup that promised him the collaborative environment he preferred. 6 months later, I heard through industry contacts that his new company was struggling with the same issues that had plagued Innovate Tech: missed deadlines, unclear accountability, and frustrated clients. Meanwhile, several of his former teammates had been promoted within our organization and were thriving under the clearer structure and expectations. This taught me that Machiavelli's approach to leadership isn't about being cruel or dismissive of people's concerns. It's about understanding that effective leadership often requires making unpopular decisions for the greater good. The goal isn't to be feared for its own sake, but to be trusted to make hard choices when collaborative approaches would fail. The experience also revealed something important about democratic versus effective decision-making in organizational contexts. True democracy works when all participants have equal stakes in the outcome and comparable expertise to evaluate options. In most workplace situations, neither condition exists. Pretending otherwise creates the illusion of fairness while actually serving no one's interests effectively. But as I was learning to balance authority with genuine care for my team's success, I was about to discover that the most sophisticated approach wasn't choosing between fear and love at all. It was understanding when and how to be both simultaneously. Upon this, one has to remark that men ought either to be well treated or crushed, because they can avenge themselves of lighter injuries, of more serious ones they cannot. Therefore, the injury that is to be done to a man ought to be of such a kind that one does not stand in fear of revenge. Niccolo Machiavelli. After successfully leading the integration project, I thought I'd mastered the fear versus love equation. But my next challenge would teach me that true Machiavellian mastery isn't about choosing sides. It's about understanding how to be strategically feared and genuinely loved simultaneously. This lesson came through my relationship with Emma, a brilliant but struggling developer on my team, and my evolving dynamic with Sarah, who was now facing her own leadership challenges. Emma had joined our team as part of the Innovate Tech acquisition, and she was a perfect example of why simple fear-based leadership often fails. She was incredibly talented, but had been beaten down by years of micromanagement at her previous startup. When I first started setting clear expectations and deadlines, Emma interpreted my directness as criticism and began shutting down completely. She'd complete assignments to the bare minimum requirements, avoid speaking in meetings, and generally behave like someone waiting to be fired. My initial instinct was to double down on the authority approach that had worked during the integration. But I quickly realized that Emma wasn't resisting my leadership. She was terrified of disappointing me. She'd been conditioned to expect punishment for any mistake, so she was playing it safe to an extreme that was actually hindering her performance. Fear without trust was creating paralysis, not excellence. The breakthrough came when I noticed Emma staying late one Friday, struggling with a complex coding problem that should have been escalated hours earlier. Instead of pointing out that she should have asked for help sooner, I sat down next to her and started working through the problem together. "Emma," I said, "I need you to understand something. My job isn't to catch you making mistakes, it's to help you succeed. But I can't do that if you don't tell me when you're stuck." Over the following weeks, I developed what I now think of as the dual-track approach. With Emma, I maintained the same high standards and clear expectations I had with everyone else. This was the fear component, ensuring she understood that quality and deadlines were non-negotiable, but I paired this with intensive support, regular check-ins, and explicit encouragement. This was the love component, ensuring she felt safe to take risks and ask for help. The results were remarkable. Emma began volunteering for challenging projects, speaking up in meetings with innovative solutions, and eventually became one of our strongest performers. But what really struck me was her explanation during a one-on-one review. "You're the first manager who made me afraid to disappoint you because I respect you, not because I'm scared of you." That distinction was everything. Meanwhile, Sarah was facing her own leadership challenges in her new role as marketing director. She'd been promoted after her previous company experience, and she was struggling with a team that included several people who'd been passed over for the position she now held. Unlike my situation with clear authority from day one, Sarah was dealing with subtle undermining and passive resistance from colleagues who questioned her legitimacy. Watching Sarah navigate this taught me another crucial aspect of the dual approach. She couldn't rely purely on institutional authority because some of her team members had longer tenure and established relationships within the company. Instead, she had to simultaneously demonstrate competence that would earn their respect while maintaining enough firmness to establish her leadership position. Sarah's strategy was brilliant. She identified the team's biggest ongoing problem, inconsistent messaging across different marketing channels, and tackled it personally. Instead of delegating the solution, she dove deep into the data, developed a comprehensive strategy, and presented it as a collaborative framework rather than top-down mandates. This demonstrated both her expertise and her respect for the team's input. But when one team member, Kevin, continued to resist implementation and badmouth her decisions in private conversations, Sarah didn't ignore it or try to win him over with additional kindness. She addressed it directly and professionally. "Kevin, I've heard concerns about the new messaging strategy. I'd rather discuss these directly with me so we can address any valid issues and move forward as a unified team." The dual message was clear. She valued collaboration and feedback, but she wouldn't tolerate undermining behavior. Kevin could work with her constructively or face the consequences of continued resistance. Most importantly, she delivered this message in front of the entire team, making it clear that respectful disagreement was welcome while sabotage was not. The combination of demonstrated competence and clear boundaries transformed Sarah's team dynamics within months. Kevin either adapted his behavior or marginalized himself through continued resistance. Either outcome worked for Sarah. The rest of the team saw that she was both capable and decisive, which created the foundation for genuine respect rather than grudging compliance. This experience taught me that the most sophisticated application of Machiavellian principles involves creating different relationships with different people based on their needs and your objectives. With high performers like Emma who needed encouragement, the emphasis was on support combined with high standards. With resistors like Kevin, the emphasis was on clear consequences combined with opportunities for redemption. The key insight was understanding that fear and love aren't opposites in effective leadership. They're complementary tools that serve different functions. Strategic fear establishes boundaries and expectations, ensuring that people understand the consequences of their choices. Genuine care builds trust and psychological safety, ensuring that people feel supported in meeting those expectations. But the most important lesson was recognizing that this dual approach only works when both components are authentic. Emma responded to my support because she could see that my high standards came from wanting her to succeed, not from wanting to control her. Sarah's team respected her firmness because they could see it was about protecting the team's effectiveness, not about protecting her ego. The synthesis became my default leadership style. Be absolutely clear about standards and consequences while being equally clear about your investment in people's success. Make it easy for people to succeed and difficult for them to fail without accountability. Create environments where people are afraid of disappointing themselves and their teammates. not afraid of arbitrary punishment from authority figures. This approach required much more emotional intelligence and situational awareness than pure fear or pure love strategies. I had to constantly read individual team members, understand their motivations and concerns, and adjust my approach accordingly. But the results, in terms of both performance and job satisfaction, were dramatically superior to any single approach strategy I'd tried. However, mastering this synthesis also revealed how easy it was to get the balance wrong, and how important it was to recognize the warning signs when your approach wasn't working as intended. He who has relied least on fortune is established the strongest. Niccolo Machiavelli. Mastering the dual approach felt like reaching the mountaintop, but Machiavelli understood something crucial about power. The moment you think you've figured it out is usually when you're about to make your biggest mistakes. My education in recognizing the warning signs came through two painful experiences. One where I swung too far toward fear and nearly destroyed my relationship with Sarah, and another where I became too comfortable with love and almost lost control of my team entirely. The first warning sign I should have recognized was when people stopped bringing me problems. In late 2022, I noticed that my team meetings had become eerily smooth. Everyone agreed with my proposals, no one raised concerns about timelines, and there were fewer questions about project specifications. Initially, I interpreted this as evidence that my leadership was working. The team was finally operating efficiently without constant friction and debate. But Sarah noticed what I was missing during one of our dinner conversations. "When's the last time someone on your team disagreed with you about something important?" she asked. I started to defend my team's alignment, but as I thought about it, I realized she was right. Emma, who had become one of my strongest performers, had stopped pushing back on technical decisions, even when I could see doubt in her eyes. Marcus's replacement, David Kim, was completing every assignment exactly as specified, without the innovative modifications he used to suggest. The truth hit me during a project post-mortem, when one of our deliverables had failed to meet client expectations. Instead of the collaborative problem-solving I expected, the team sat in uncomfortable silence when I asked what had gone wrong. Finally, Emma spoke up. "David, we all knew the client's requirements had shifted after our initial design phase, but we weren't sure if you wanted us to flag that or just stick to the original plan." They'd been afraid to bring me information that might complicate my decisions. I'd accidentally created an environment where my team was more focused on avoiding my disappointment than on achieving the best possible outcomes. This was strategic fear gone wrong. Instead of inspiring excellence, it was inspiring conformity. People were so concerned with meeting my expectations that they'd stopped thinking critically about whether those expectations made sense in evolving circumstances. The correction required swallowing my pride and admitting to the team that I'd overcorrected toward authority. "I need you to know that I'd rather deal with complicated problems early than perfect compliance that leads to project failures," I told them during our next team meeting. "If you see issues I'm missing, it's your job to bring them to my attention, even if you think I won't want to hear it." But just as I was recalibrating toward more collaborative leadership, I made the opposite mistake with Sarah. Our relationship had been thriving under the mutual respect and clear boundaries we'd established, but I began interpreting her increased comfort with me as permission to lower my own standards. I stopped being as punctual for our plans, started taking her emotional support for granted, and generally began behaving like someone who assumed her love was unconditional. The warning signs were obvious in retrospect. Sarah started making more plans with friends that didn't include me. She became less interested in hearing about my work challenges and more focused on her own goals and projects. Most tellingly, she stopped fighting with me about things that bothered her, not because they stopped bothering her, but because she was emotionally withdrawing from the relationship. The wake-up call came when I casually mentioned that I'd probably need to work through our planned weekend trip to visit her parents because of a crisis at work. The third time I'd prioritized work over our relationship plans in 2 months. Instead of the argument I expected, Sarah just nodded and said, "Okay, I'll go by myself." Her calm acceptance was more alarming than anger would have been. That night I realized I'd fallen into the love dependency trap I'd watched destroy so many other relationships. I'd become confident that Sarah's feelings for me were strong enough to withstand any amount of inconsideration. I was taking her love for granted in exactly the way Machiavelli warned against, assuming that affection without respect could sustain a partnership indefinitely. The conversation we had that weekend was one of the most difficult of our relationship. Sarah was direct about what had been happening. "David, I love you, but I don't respect how you've been treating our relationship lately. You've started acting like my feelings don't matter as much as your convenience. That needs to change, or we need to reevaluate what we're doing here." Her willingness to risk the relationship rather than continue accepting substandard treatment was exactly the kind of strategic boundary setting I'd been learning to apply in other areas of my life. She was demonstrating that real love requires mutual respect, and that respect requires the possibility of consequences when boundaries are crossed. These two experiences taught me to watch for specific warning signs that indicated my approach was off balance. When people stop bringing me problems or challenging my decisions, I'm probably leaning too heavily on authority and need to create more psychological safety. When people start taking my investment in them for granted or treating my boundaries as suggestions, I'm probably being too accommodating and need to re-establish clear expectations. The most reliable indicator became observing whether people were performing at their highest level or just trying to avoid problems. Peak performance requires both security and accountability. People need to feel safe enough to take risks and push boundaries, but they also need to understand that there are real consequences for falling short of their potential. In romantic relationships, the warning signs were different but equally clear. If Sarah stopped sharing her real opinions about things that mattered to her, I was probably being too domineering and needed to create more space for her autonomy. If she stopped holding me accountable for behaviors that affected her, I was probably taking advantage of her affection and needed to recommit to treating her with the respect she deserved. The hardest lesson was learning that sustainable relationships, whether professional or personal, require constant calibration. The balance between fear and love isn't something you achieve once and then maintain automatically. People's needs change, circumstances evolve, and what worked in one context might be completely wrong in another. But perhaps most importantly, I learned that the warning signs usually appear long before the relationship reaches a crisis point. The key was developing enough self-awareness to notice when people's behavior toward me was shifting, and enough honesty to ask myself whether I was contributing to problems instead of automatically assuming others were being unreasonable or oversensitive. This ongoing calibration process would become the foundation for the final piece of my Machiavellian education, understanding that true mastery isn't about perfect execution of these principles, but about building a life and career that reflects your authentic values while still engaging effectively with the realities of power and human nature. The lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. Therefore, it is necessary to be a fox to discover the traps, and a lion to terrify the wolves. Niccolo Machiavelli. 5 years have passed since I picked up that dusty PDF of The Prince in my cramped Austin apartment, and I'm writing this from my office in downtown Seattle, not because I'm working late, but because I choose to be here. The transformation from that desperate people-pleaser to someone who genuinely understands how power works wasn't just about learning Machiavelli's principles, it was about discovering who I actually was when I stopped performing for everyone else's approval. The final test of everything I'd learned came 6 months ago when I was offered the position of VP of Operations at our company. The role came with a significant salary increase, equity that could set up my financial future, and the kind of leadership responsibility I'd been working toward for years. It also came with a catch that would have terrified my younger self. I'd be responsible for a major restructuring that would eliminate approximately 30% of our workforce while positioning the company for sustainable growth. The old David would have either declined the position to avoid being seen as the bad guy or accepted it and tried to find ways to avoid making the hard decisions. But 5 years of Machiavellian education had taught me that real leadership means accepting responsibility for difficult choices that serve the greater good. even when those choices make you temporarily unpopular with people you genuinely care about. The restructuring process took 4 months and was the most challenging professional experience of my life. I had to eliminate positions held by people I'd worked with for years, including some who had become genuine friends. I had to make decisions based on business necessity rather than personal relationships, which meant keeping some people I liked less but who were more critical to our operations, while letting go of others who were wonderful humans but whose roles had become redundant. What made it bearable was everything I'd learned about the difference between being cruel and being decisive. Every termination conversation was handled with honesty, dignity, and as much support as I could provide. I made sure severance packages were generous, helped people network for new opportunities, and was transparent about the business reasoning behind each decision. I was firm about the necessity of the changes while being genuinely caring about their impact on individuals. The results exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own. The remaining team was more focused, productive, and actually happier because unclear responsibilities and redundant processes had been eliminated. Revenue per employee increased by 40% within 6 months. Most importantly, we avoided the layoffs that many of our competitors had to implement the following year because we'd proactively addressed our structural issues. But the personal victory was more significant than the professional one. I'd managed to make extremely difficult decisions while maintaining the respect of my remaining team and even some of the people who'd been let go. Several former employees reached out months later to thank me for how I'd handled their transitions. My approach had been feared in the sense that people knew I'd make hard choices when necessary, but loved in the sense that they trusted me to make those choices fairly and with genuine concern for everyone involved. Sarah and I got engaged during this period, and our relationship had become the clearest example of how Machiavellian principles could enhance rather than damage intimate connections. We both maintained clear boundaries and high standards while being deeply supportive of each other's growth and success. Neither of us was afraid of disappointing the other, but both of us were motivated to be worthy of the respect we'd earned from each other. The engagement itself was a perfect example of how these principles had changed my approach to major life decisions. Instead of proposing based on what I thought Sarah wanted to hear or what would generate the most dramatic social media moments, I focused on what felt authentic to our relationship and values. The proposal was private, thoughtful, and based on genuine conversations we'd had about our future together. It wasn't designed to impress anyone else, it was designed to honor what we'd built together. Looking back on this 5-year journey, I realized that Machiavelli's greatest gift wasn't teaching me how to be feared or loved. It was teaching me how to be authentic in a world that rewards performance over substance. Every relationship in my life, from professional to personal, became more honest and ultimately more satisfying when I stopped trying to manage other people's perceptions and started focusing on living according to my own values and standards. The most surprising discovery was that being strategic about power dynamics actually made me more generous, not less. When you're not desperate for approval, you can afford to be genuinely helpful. When you're confident in your own value, you don't need to diminish others to feel important. When you understand how influence really works, you can use it to create positive outcomes instead of just protecting yourself from negative ones. My team now comes to me with problems instead of trying to hide them, because they know I'm more interested in solving issues than assigning blame. My friends respect my time and boundaries because they know I respect theirs. My relationship with Sarah is built on mutual admiration rather than mutual neediness, because we both bring our full selves to the partnership instead of trying to be whoever we think the other person wants. The revolution wasn't about becoming a different person. It was about becoming who I actually was when I wasn't trying to be who I thought everyone else wanted me to be. Machiavelli didn't teach me to be calculating or manipulative. He taught me to be clear-eyed about human nature and strategic about protecting what matters most to me. If you're reading this and recognizing yourself in the person I used to be, the people pleaser, the one who thinks being nice is enough, the one who's frustrated that good intentions aren't being rewarded with good outcomes, I want you to understand something important. You don't need to become a different person to apply these principles. You need to become more yourself, but with better boundaries and clearer understanding of how the world actually works. The choice Machiavelli offered isn't really between being feared or loved. It's between being intentional about your life or letting other people's expectations and manipulations determine your path. It's between understanding the games everyone is playing or being played by people who understand them better than you do. It's between building relationships based on mutual respect or settling for relationships based on mutual convenience. 5 years ago, I thought power was something other people had, and I needed to earn through perfect behavior. Now I understand that power is something you take responsibility for, and the most powerful thing you can do is decide to live according to your own standards while respecting the reality of how human relationships actually function. That's not just Machiavellian wisdom. That's the foundation of a life worth living.